I love learning about history, especially war history. Interesting fact, though World War II only lasted 6 years from 1939 to 1945, it was by far the most deadly war in history, with the total deaths being more than double the deaths of the next deadliest war. The war reached every corner and every continent of the globe, even in the West. Now I'm sure everyone knows about Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, a day that would live in infamy.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the Empire of Japan.
It was the only time Japan ever successfully launched an attack on American soil. Or was it? Pearl Harbor was so well known because it ultimately dragged the United States into World War II. What most people don't know is that from 1941 to 1945, Japan would go on to attack United States soil several times, and on some occasions hold it pretty successfully. Only 6 months after Pearl Harbor, one such attack was on the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. This was done as a precautionary measure, protecting their northern flank and preventing the Americans from attacking across the northern Pacific. In what was thought to be a strategy by Commander Isoroku Yamamoto, both the attack on the Aleutian Islands and the Battle of Midway were carried out on the same day. As a result, the smaller Aleutian Islands campaign is often overshadowed by the more deadly Battle of Midway and forgotten. On June 3rd and 4th, Japan launched an attack on Dutch Harbor and Adak Island, though at the time, Adak was uninhabited. The naval base at Dutch Harbor suffered the full brunt of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Americans lost 43 people. All were military except for a single civilian among them. 50 more were injured and 14 aircraft were destroyed. In the chaos, much of the fort and harbor was destroyed, but the Americans managed to destroy 8 enemy aircraft. And some guy even said he downed one of them by throwing a wrench at one. Actually, I'm not sure how true that one is. Though mostly unknown, this battle was extremely important in the war against Japan. On Akutan Island, 20 miles northeast of Dutch Harbor, a Mitsubishi A6M20 was found crash-landed. Its pilot was killed in the crash, but the plane was in working condition. This plane was dubbed the Akutan Zero. I'll talk more about that plane later. Needless to say, Americans were shocked at the news of this attack, and a lot of people thought that this attack would be a stepping stone to a full-out invasion of the West Coast. On June 6th and June 7th, the Japanese attacked and captured the islands of Kiska and Attu. Still reeling from the effects of Pearl Harbor, the Americans were concentrated mostly on just building their navy back up, so a counterattack didn't come immediately. In August 1942, the Americans established an airbase on Adak Island, and they carried out bombing runs against the Japanese on Kiska, which the Japanese had decided to use for their main naval base in the Aleutians. On January 12, 1943, the Americans landed in Constantine Harbor, on Amchitka Island, which was free of Japanese forces. They chose Amchitka because of its close proximity to Kiska, only 50 miles away. In February, they constructed an airfield on the island specifically for use in bombing sorties on Kiska. In March 1943, the Navy set up a blockade around Kiska and Attu. On the 26th, while a Japanese fleet attempted to resupply their troops on Attu, a battle broke out between the US and Japanese navies, in what would be known as the Battle of Komodorsky Islands. The Japanese fleet withdrew, spelling victory for the Americans and leaving the Japanese troops on Kiska and Attu with little supplies. From this point on in the campaign, the Japanese decided that these ships would be too risky to use, and instead opted to use submarines exclusively. The problem with submarines, however, is that they don't hold nearly as much supplies as ships, which began to exact a heavy toll on the Japanese soldiers stationed on the islands. This battle also put US forces in a perfect position to attack the Japanese garrisons on both islands. The invasion of Attu started on May 11, 1943, calling it Operation LANDGRAB, where they landed 11,000 troops. The Americans quickly took the beaches as the Japanese retreated into the mountains. The operation that was expected to be but a few short days was lengthened into 2 weeks thanks to the bad weather. The weather ended up causing more deaths for the American troops than the Japanese forces did. Food shortages, frostbite, and other infections caused by the extreme cold affected American morale as they battled the sparse but heavily fortified Japanese forces. By the end of the month, the Japanese forces were cornered by the American troops, on land and the Navy on sea. They knew this was it. Colonel Yamasaki, who led the troops on the island, decided to perform one final charge. This is one of the largest banzai charges in history. By the end of the day, 2,300 Japanese troops lay dead, and only 28 were taken alive. This ended the Battle of Attu, which was the only land battle fought on American soil throughout the entire war. It was the first time since the War of 1812 that a foreign power was able to take and hold U.S. territory. That left only the island of Kiska. On August 15th and 16th, 1943, thousands of American and Canadian troops launched Operation COTTAGE in order to take back Kiska. However, they found that the island had been long abandoned by the Japanese troops. The Japanese were able to retreat under the cover of fog on July 28th, only 2 weeks earlier. The Allies still ended up suffering over 300 casualties, including 92 deaths from the cold, booby traps, and friendly fire. After 9 days, on August 24th, the uninhabited island of Kiska was finally declared secure, and the nearly forgotten Aleutian Islands campaign came to an end. So the big question is, why was the Aleutian Islands campaign so important? If the Japanese successfully seized Alaska, it would have put them into a perfect position to attack the United States West Coast and control transport in the North Pacific. These Alaskan air bases also proved to be crucial for bombing runs of Japanese-controlled islands later in the war. Also, remember this plane? Just how big of a deal was this plane? Well, historians have called it a prize almost beyond value to the United States. One of the greatest prizes of the Pacific War, and no less serious than the Japanese defeat at the Battle of Midway. Whole books were written about the plane and Tadayoshi Koga, the guy who flew it. It would be no exaggeration to say that this discovery was one of the biggest reasons the Americans gained the upper hand in the Pacific. You have to understand, the Zero was something out of legend. It was as fast as it was dangerous. Piloted by a competent fighter pilot, it was more than a match for any of the planes that the Americans or the British were using at the time. Piloted by the greatest aces that Japan had to offer, it was invincible. But just as Apollo guided the arrow towards the heel of Achilles, the Akatan Zero spelled certain defeat for the Empire of Japan. The Mitsubishi Zeros were feared throughout World War II for a ton of reasons I won't get into, but the Akatan Zero proved to be a key to finding these weaknesses and winning the war. If you're interested in the specifics, I recommend watching this video, which talks about the mechanical strengths and weaknesses of the infamous Mitsubishi Zero. Believe it or not, this wasn't the only time Japan attacked the Continental United States during World War II, and I'll talk about that in another video. But I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you like what you learned, be sure to leave a thumbs up and smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. And remember, a leader leads by example, not by force.